Hello, Brovs. We're back with Trousered, Apes, Sick Literature, and a Sick Society by Duncan Williams. I believe it was 1970s, or was it earlier? 71. We are at Chapter 2, Man and Brute. It requires a pretty deal of pains to distinguish ourselves from brutes. We must have a share of probity, honor, gratitude, good sense, and a complacency for our species in general to render us worthy of that name, so that all who are designed for men are not rightly called so, till acquired advantages confirm their title. Miss Mary Davies, the accomplished rake, 1727. Okay. Western man from pre-Socratic times has recognized the essential dualism of his nature, but the combined forces of Christianity and classicism, utilizing what one may term moral absolutism, stressed the importance of the spiritual and frowned upon the sensual and animalistic. Thus, St. Paul, in his epistle to the Philippians, urges them to let their thoughts run upon whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are elevated, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure. In the treatise on the sublime, attributed possibly erroneously to Longinus, but certainly the work of an author deeply imbued with classical thought, we find the following. Nature has appointed us men to be no base or ignoble animals, but when she ushers us into life and into the vast universe, forthwith she implants in our souls the unconquerable love of whatever is elevated and more divine than we. Finally, Dante, who can be regarded as a classical Christian humanist, unites these two trends in Western thought, observing in De Vulgari Eloquentia, written at the beginning of the 14th century, that as man has been endowed with a threefold life, namely vegetable, animal, and rational, he journeys along a threefold road, for in so far as he is vegetable, he seeks for what is useful, wherein he is of like nature with the plants. In so far as he is animal, he seeks for that which is pleasurable, wherein he is of like nature with the brutes. In so far as he is rational, he seeks for what is right, and in this he stands alone, or is a partaker of the nature of the angels. These three quotations embody the fundamental beliefs on which Western civilization has been built, and it was not until the latter half of the 18th century, following upon and hastening the decline of neoclassical thought, that they were seriously questioned as a basis for morals and ethics. During the past 2 centuries, however, with spasmodic and ever-weakening reactions, these beliefs have been eroded until today. There are few educated persons under the age of 30 who would not rather substitute for them William Blake's aphorism, "Sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires." One contemporary playwright, Edward Bond, appears to have taken this quite literally in his play Saved, 1965, in which a baby is stoned to death in its perambulator by some youths. And it should have read perambulator. I know that word, but there you go. The 20th century interest in Blake is an identifiable manifestation of our epoch, the dominant trend of which has been an almost total rejection of the old moral sanctions and a search for self-fulfillment, or as George Santayana has stated, a many-sided insurrection of the unregenerate natural man against the regimen of Christendom. Thus, in 1926, we find the critic I.A. Richards writing in Science and Poetry, "People who are always winning victories over themselves might equally well be described as always enslaving themselves. Their lives become unnecessarily narrow. The minds of many saints have been like wells. They should have been like lakes or like the sea." Italics are the authors. Later in the same work, he defines an evil experience as one which is self-thwarting or conducive to stultifying conflicts. T.S. Eliot carried this idea a stage further in his praise of Baudelaire in 1930 when he wrote, "It is better, in a paradoxical way, to do evil than to do nothing. At least we exist." This is, of course, simply a restatement of Blake's active evil is better than passive good. But it is also a dominant theme in The Wasteland, undoubtedly the most influential poem of this century. Although it is significant that the views of the older Eliot differ markedly from the foregoing, which also explains their comparative lack of popularity. The Eliot of The Wasteland resembles a sea captain who, having scuttled his ship, rows off in a small lifeboat named Anglo-Catholicism and leaves the vast majority of his crew and passengers drowning. The extraordinary thing is that they appear to have enjoyed the experience. They enjoyed being told that they were living in Rat's Alley and settled back to luxuriate in their social and religious ruins. There is a cult of despair today, and any optimism is regarded as sentimental drivel or worse. Trilling, in Beyond Culture, to which I have already referred, says that the imagination of felicity is difficult for us to exercise. We feel that it is a betrayal of our awareness of our world of pain, that it is politically inappropriate. He proceeds to draw attention to the psychic fact that more and more of our authors, and presumably their readers, repudiate pleasure and seek gratification in, to use Freud's word, unpleasure. This last remark would have appeared arrant nonsense to Samuel Johnson, who declared that the only end of writing is to enable the reader better to enjoy life or better to endure it. The cult of unpleasure might seem to have no connection with the violence and animalism, which are the predominant characteristics of modern literature. But if we examine this phenomenon a little more closely, we shall see that it is yet another integral part of the compact unity of our age. Violence is almost invariably the result of a sadistic impulse. The cult of unpleasure is simply another term for masochism. One does not need to be a psychologist to recognize in both these impulses the same desire to hurt. And footnote 1 says Eric Fromm recognizes the persistent conjunction of these two in certain personalities. Both tendencies, he suggests, are the outcome of an inability to bear the isolation and weakness of one's own self. That's from Escape from Freedom. They are, in fact, two sides of the same coin and equally repugnant to the classical idea of civilized man, an idea based upon serenity or inner harmony, dignity, and restraint. To the extent that modern artists and writers lack this inner harmony, their products might be termed neurotic, were it not that all such normative judgments seem nowadays to be taboo. This modern trend away from the old moral sanctions and external morality towards self-fulfillment can be observed in theology, philosophy, and other disciplines, as well as in literature. Thus, the new morality of the former Bishop of Woolwich, John Robinson, and Situation Ethics by Joseph Fletcher both revolve around this tendency, as indeed do the philosophical tenets of Christian existentialism. Basically, I have no quarrel with such views which uphold the substitution of individual, i.e., internal, standards for the old-fashioned, legalistic, and external ones. There is, however, a very real danger in the popularization of such ideas. Self-fulfillment demands a certain measure of restraint, of self-control. This is an adult concept, as I think even its exponents would agree. And in between these two plateau, the old morality and the new self-fulfillment or self-actualization, there exists a chasm into which, while attempting to cross, the majority fails. This chasm is self-indulgence, a descent to mere animal gratification, which presents the greatest danger to the immature who, vaguely aware of the demise of the old sanctions, delight in the permissiveness which increasingly pervades our society. The paperback revolution, coinciding with concepts expounded by and intended for spiritually and morally adult minds, brings to a growing youthful majority a distorted message: instant gratification of all appetites with no bill to pay. This is not the intention of those who formulate these concepts, but the inevitable result of an egalitarian society in which everything must be made available at all times to everyone. The dangerous consequences of this attitude will be more fully dealt with in a subsequent chapter. The neoclassicists of the first half of the 18th century were well aware of the narrow margin which separates man from the brutes. Swift's yahoos were a terrible object lesson in what could happen to man if he were to forsake reason and abandon himself to his passions. Throughout the period, poets, novelists, philosophers, and theologians impressed upon society the need for restraint and self-control. Samuel Johnson expressed clearly and concisely the attitude of his age to the passions when he observed, "Whatever withdraws us from the power of our senses advances us in the dignity of thinking beings." I suspect that the average modern, regardless of his cultural or social background, would regard all such ideas as stuffy or pompous, and in his temporal provincialism ridicule them. Yet a shrewd observer, F.R. Leavis, has pointed out that the insistence on good form which characterized that age was more than merely a social facade. With Dryden begins the period of English literature when form is associated with good form, and when, strange as it may seem to us, good form could be a serious preoccupation for the intelligent because it meant not mere conformity to a code of manners, but a cultivated sensitiveness to the finest art and thought of the time. Politeness was not merely superficial, it was the service of a culture and a civilization, and the substance and solid bases were so undeniably there that there was no need to discuss them or to ask what was meant by sense. Revaluation 1964. It is worth pausing to examine exactly what were these fundamental beliefs of neoclassicism to which Leavis refers. Broadly speaking, there was a widespread feeling that man had at last reached the state of civilized existence, or at least was thought capable of leading such an existence. Poets and artists, philosophers and theologians prized clarity, ease, and balance, and looked back in horror to what the historian Edward Gibbon called the dark age of false and barbarous science. The diamond had been found, and all that remained was to polish it until it reached the stage of near perfection. Philosophically and theologically, the educated and the cultivated lean toward deism, which, with its emphasis upon a reasoned approach to religion and a corresponding lack of interest and belief in the more supernatural elements of Christianity, seems in retrospect so inevitably suited to the age. Above all, man saw himself as being in harmony with the universe, which in turn was seen as the outward manifestation of the mind of the Creator. As Alexander Pope expressed it, all are but parts of one stupendous whole, whose body nature is, and God the soul. It was by modern standards a comfortable cosmic view which posed the question of how man could best attain a state approaching the perfection of the universal order which surrounded him. It was to this moral question that the leading minds of the age addressed themselves, and, to a surprising extent, a consensus emerged as to what constituted this idea. Nor should we smile condescendingly on such a search. Hegel has remarked that the highest point in the development of a people is reached when they have reduced its laws, its ideas of justice and morality to a science. One might add that a strong culture invariably manifests the widespread belief in the validity of its basic norms. The converse is also true. The idea of neoclassicism has been well expressed by Walter Jackson Bate in From Classic to Romantic, when he talks of decorum as the simultaneous preservation and ennobling of the type. He also points to the essential contrast between the neoclassical outlook and the naturalistic. The more extreme naturalist may be said to assume the lowest as the norm and to view whatever is better as an unexpected gain, while the classicist conceives the highest as the norm and regards whatever falls below not as natural but as corruption. Traces of this classical outlook recur in the 19th century. Matthew Arnold, for example, maintained that culture shows its single-minded love of perfection, its desire simply to make reason and the will of God prevail. If we apply Bates' statement to the two extracts from Jane Austen and John Osborne, which we examined briefly in the last chapter, it can easily be seen into which category each will fall. Jane Austen would regard Jimmy Porter as a slovenly vulgarian, as abnormal, because he would appear to her refined and civilized mind as a latter-day Yahoo, whereas Osborne would regard Mr. Bennet as a representative of the hateful country gentry, the embodiment of affectation and repression, and therefore of abnormality. In one important respect, however, most modern writers differ from Bates' naturalists by regarding anything better than the norm with suspicion and hostility as a relic of the past, as a civilizing influence to be hunted down and destroyed. This is partly due to the temporal provincialism of the 20th century, which stems from an ignorant self-sufficiency. To a much greater extent, however, it originates in a cultural and social inferiority complex, never acknowledged and scarcely recognized even by those who manifest it most markedly. Again, Jimmy Porter is a revealing example exhibiting precisely this same inferiority complex in his relationship with Allison, as do the majority of contemporary writers and artists in relation to Western culture. Surprisingly, support for this statement has been supplied by Pablo Picasso in a confession published in the French periodical Le Spectacle du Monde, November 1962. Picasso, after admitting that when young he was enamored of the religion of great art, goes on to observe that as he grew older he perceived that art, as it had been conceived up to the end of 1800, had become sterile and moribund. Deploring the fact that his contemporaries have given their hearts to materialism, the machine, scientific discoveries, wealth, the domination of natural forces and things of this world, he asks the question, why then do the artists of today persist in sculpting and painting? His answer is that they do so out of habit, out of ostentation, a love of luxury, and for what they can get out of it, par calcul. Calcul? Admitting that from Cubism on, he himself has satisfied the public with the many bizarre notions which have come into my head, and adding that the less they, the public, understood, the more they admired them, he concludes as follows. Today, as you know, I am famous and very rich, but when I am alone with myself, I haven't the courage to consider myself an artist. In the great and ancient sense of the word, of that word, I am only a public entertainer who understands his age. The defeatism implicit in this bitter confession is not confined to painting. The whole modern cult of violence and animalism is, in essence, an admission of defeat. Since we cannot be men to any idealistic extent, let us lapse into barbaric animalism, but still clinging to vestiges of a past which we hate but cannot escape. Let us clothe our defeat in high-sounding terms: alienation, cult of unpleasure, realism, and similar jargon. Yet all this fashionable phraseology cannot conceal the fact that the emperor has no clothes. The literature of today lacks certain essential qualities. It no longer satisfies man's need for beauty, order, and elevation, and to this extent, it is incomplete and stunted. It contains, as Trillian has observed, an anti civilizing trend, and to this is closely linked a cult of ugliness, a morbid concentration on the baser elements of life, a clinical obsession with the bizarre, with the grossly sensual and degrading aspects of human nature. Footnote 1. In July 1967, Picasso's play Le Désert attrapé par la queue was given its first public performance on the outskirts of St. Tropez. In a much publicized scene, a female character, Tart, squats in the middle of the stage in a urinating position with a soundtrack while a soundtrack makes appropriate noises. I must admit that the symbolism of this particular scene escapes me, but once again, the emphasis is unmistakable. The producer of that play, Jean-Jacques Lebel, is quoted as saying, "We're not at liberty to emasculate a work of art to pander to bourgeois sentiment. The fact that there is so much opposition to the kind of thing we're doing is what gives us faith that we're on the right road." One can only conclude that M. Lebel has never read Pope's lines. So much they scorn the crowd that if the throng by chance go right, they purposely go wrong. This total rejection of tradition and of traditional morality and religion was foreseen by Spengler and denoted, in his opinion, the death throes of a culture. He anticipated the modern megalopolis, which he termed the world city, and observed that to the world city belonged not a folk, but a mob. Its uncomprehending hostility to all the traditions representative of the culture, nobility, church, privileges, dynasties, conventions in art, and limits of knowledge and science, the keen and cold intelligence that confounds the wisdom of the peasant, the new-fashioned naturalism that in relation to all matters of sex and society goes back to quite primitive instincts and conditions. All these things betoken the definite closing down of the culture and the opening of a quite new phase of human existence, provincial, late, futureless, but quite inevitable. This brilliant analysis of contemporary society was written in 1917, and the only element in it with which I shall disagree is his belief in the inevitability of the cycle. Certainly, if we accept his theory that a culture moves through successive stages, spring, summer, autumn, and winter, then who can seriously doubt that what we are witnessing today is the death of a culture and of a civilization? The frenzied attempts to create a new art form every month, the compulsive hunt for novelty, not only in the arts but in almost every sphere of human activity, the almost simultaneous acceptance and rejection of the latest, most modish experiment, however perverse or abnormal it may be, all these are symptomatic of a dying man's feverish attempts to clutch onto a swiftly ebbing life. Modern writers mostly resemble a man who has inherited a magnificent, richly furnished mansion, but out of ignorance or perversity proceeds to demolish it brick by brick and to throw the furniture away. Winter has come, and he bemoans his lack of shelter and warmth. It may be recalled that in the novel Charlie is My Darling, a group of children systematically wrecks a house. The author, Joyce Carey, in his preparatory essay, after remarking that in real life such raids are not at all uncommon, goes on to observe that they are frequently caused by rage. A rage against beauty and dignity by those who have neither but feel the want. This would appear to lend support to my previous statement that many contemporary writers are subconsciously motivated by a similar feeling of inferiority in their relationship with the beauty and dignity of the past, resulting in an urge to destroy what they can neither surpass nor emulate. It is surely significant that Allen Ginsberg, one of the most influential poets among contemporary youth, entitled his first collective volume Howl, that Evelyn Waugh, the most gifted of British satirists, named the last novel which he wrote Unconditional Surrender, and that the American poet Robinson Jeffers once described civilization as a transient sickness. The epigrammatic quality of this last remark should not blind one to its essential silliness. Civilization is nothing more than the restraining influence which prevents man from lapsing into barbarism, from descending to the level of the Ahu, and no amount of persuasive casuistry or facile meliorism should blind one to this fact. The necessity for writing the above so soon after the bestialities of the Nazi concentration camps have been revealed is proof, if such is needed, of the temporal provincialism of our age. Already the new advocates of the perfectibility of man through anarchy are raising their voices and demanding freedom from the irksome restrictions of civilized society. It would be interesting to know what alternative to civilization Jeffers could provide. And you know what? I know a lot about Jeffers, quite frankly, and I will tell you at some pointer. Were this feeling confined to an ineffectual, if vociferous minority, it would not matter overmuch. But it is surely time to acknowledge the danger signals when a critic of Leslie Fiedler's perspicacity sees a wariness in the West which undercuts the struggle between socialism and capitalism, democracy and autocracy, a wariness with humanism itself which underlines all the movements of our world, a wariness with the striving to be men. After all, as Karl Jaspers has expressed it in Existence of Philosophy, to fail to be human would mean to slip into nothingness. William Golding's Lord of the Flies reinforces this warning. In one respect, however, Golding's book distorts the picture. There is no naval officer to rescue us from the onslaught of savagery. The news of his, God's death, has permeated, secularized, and radically changed every aspect of Western thought and society. The tragic consequences of this awareness are implicit throughout the remainder of this book. I mean, Jeffers, and I will probably pull out a book of Jeffers to reiterate his philosophy of inhumanism, which is a turning away from man and back towards nature. But not now. I shall do it later. It's too late, and I've been reading too much. But I kind of figured Jeffers would appear in here because he was quite I'm not necessarily anti-man, but basically the man that they're speaking of here, anti-trousered ape. Anyway, that's all for now, bruvs. Goodbye, bruvs. Goodbye.